Hi, everybody. Welcome to Horsepower Heritage. I'm Maurice Merrick, and Happy New Year to all of you listening from places like Rochester, New York, Hohokus, New Jersey, Houston, Texas, Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, Tel Aviv, Israel, and Helsinki, Finland. Oh, boy, I bet it is so cold in Helsinki right now. Well, thanks for listening, and as always, don't forget to smash that follow button and tell your friends about the show. And I gotta say, it feels good to be back here after taking a few weeks off. And I hope you had some quality time with friends and family over the holidays as well. And I know things aren't easy for anyone right now, and we don't need to get into all of that, but I wish you a happy and healthy 2022. And I've got some cool stuff coming up on the podcast. So thanks for being here. And by the way, I haven't been completely idle lately. I've booked some pretty interesting guests that are coming up, and I've been editing some new videos for the YouTube channel. So things are rolling right along here. And today I've got a great conversation for you with a guy named Bobby Green. Now, Bobby does so much cool stuff. I don't know where he gets his energy, but check this out. First, he's the conceptual genius behind the 1933 Group, which is a collection of 11 historic Los Angeles bars and restaurants, even a vintage bowling alley, and they each have a great period theme to every property, right? So Bobby told me the story behind his business empire, which, as you'll hear, is really tied closely with some incredible automotive history and development of the city of LA. And Bobby is also a hot rodder, and he runs his belly tank racer at Bonneville, and he's also the creator of the Old Crow Speed Shop, which is really kind of his tribute to the early history of American racing and hot rodding. And by the way, this whole interview is also going to be over on the Horsepower Heritage YouTube channel shortly, so subscribe over there because you've got to see his inner sanctum. It was like stepping back in time to the early 1930s. Really cool. So this one's got hot rods, salt racing, early Indy car history, even a barn find Porsche 550 Spider. That's a great story. So stay tuned for my interview with Bobby Green from the Old Crow Speed Shop. And that's coming up right after this. This episode of Horsepower Heritage is sponsored by Model Citizen Diecast. Maybe you can't afford that Shelby 289 Cobra or that Porsche 356 Speedster, but having a scale model on the shelf is easy with Model Citizen Diecast. They stock collector-grade scale models in 1/43rd scale, 1/18th scale, and even the massive 1/8th scale masterpieces from the Amalgam Collection. And if you use the promo code HERITAGE at checkout, they'll give you 10% off your order. Limitations apply. Just visit ModelCitizenDiecast.com and check out their great selection. From race cars to classic cars and everything in between. Model Citizen Diecast, because your inner child still wants to play with cars. Well, here we are at the Old Crow Speed Shop with Bobby Green, the proprietor. Bobby, thanks for having us. This place is amazing, and I understand you just moved here after being in Burbank for about 15 years.
Yeah, well, Maurice, thanks for coming by.
Absolutely.
It's good to see you.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, I got the place in 2016, but it took a year to remodel. It took a couple of years to move in.
Sure.
Luckily, we had Burbank to slowly kind of transition from while we did it. So yeah, right. And then the pandemic hit. I haven't really done any parties or anything here, so you're one of the few that have seen it.
Well, everywhere you look, I mean, it's overwhelming.
Yeah, it was a lot of U-Haul moves. I mean, luckily it's only 20 minutes down the highway.
Right. And you were able to do it gradually, obviously.
Yeah, and gradually. That's the key.
Well, this is literally a lifetime's worth of collecting. I know this isn't everything. You've kind of let things go over the years, and you've kept what you really cherish.
Yeah. Well, I've learned some valuable lessons with Burbank. One is, no matter how big of a space someone gives me, I will fill it.
Right.
And that's not a good thing. You know what I mean? Yeah. Especially when you have to move. That's not a good thing. So, yeah, I had a lot of multiples and multiples of parts, engines and parts. It's one of those things like, well, I might as well keep this on the back shelf because I have room for it. I might need it one day, or someone will need it. So you end up with like a giant stockpile of just stuff, and stuff that's replaceable. Nothing, flathead water pumps or heads or something like that. But So when I had to leave Burbank, I just had giant yard sales. Just come take the stuff away for cheap. Just get it into hand so it doesn't have to get scrapped. because
Right.
so much gets scrapped with situations like that.
Yeah, you kind of get forced in a corner where you've got nowhere to put it, and you've got no time to sort it or really make those decisions other than, okay, put it in the bin.
Exactly. So I got it all into the hands of other hoarders. Now it's their problem now, not mine. And so I just, my goal was I'm just going to keep like the really good stuff, the really rare stuff that you can't really replace easily.
Well, and we'll have to talk about some of this stuff in here, but just so people know, this is a converted church. Built in what, the 30s?
In the 20s.
In the 20s.
Yeah, built in the 20s.
Okay.
Yeah, sadly the preacher had died, and kids didn't want to keep it going, and so it went on the market. And so I was looking to buy a shop, so I could move out of Burbank. And shop space in LA is just insane, pricing wise, just nuts. And so this happened to be much more reasonable, I think. And it was one of those situations I fall into a lot where people don't have a vision for things. They can't like see beyond what it is, and luckily I can see far beyond what it is. Give me anything, give me a high school and I'll turn it into a shop or something cool. So a church is perfect. And I remember growing up as a teenager thinking, man, it'd be really cool to get a church and just live in it.
Yeah.
Why not?
Absolutely. Old churches, old firehouses.
Firehouses for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're sort of getting ahead of ourselves a little bit because, first of all, some people are wondering, what's Old Crow Speed Shop? And we can talk about also kind of the genesis of your automotive fascination and the particular time period that you're really interested in, which is roughly the turn of the 20th century to about 1950, right?
I'd say so. Yeah, that's a perfect place to put it. So Old Crow started as the name of the belly tank that I built for Bonneville. And what I try to do with anything is create a meaning. I don't like just having mindless names or even just mindless things in a collection without there being some sort of like deeper meaning to them, So I was building this car, and the car's made from a World War II auxiliary gas tank that would hang below an aircraft fighter plane. They would use those to get more fuel so they could fly further, and then they would drop them. They call them drop tanks too, because they would just drop them from the bottom of the plane. But they were really aerodynamic, right? So the government spent millions of dollars in the 40s to create these aerodynamic pods. And then you've got these teenagers that go to World War II who are hot rodders. They see these pods, and there were some guys before the war that were hammering out bodies for their hot rods to be really streamlined. A ton of work, obviously. You're hand forming this whole thing. Well, they go to World War II, they see this thing that looked just like Bob Rufi or one of these guys had made for their car, and they're like, I'm going to get one of those after the war and make a car out of it. So that's how the belly tank or drop tank came to be a race car.
Sure. And after the war surplus, they were a dime a dozen.
They were like $20.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you could buy them by the stack, especially here in Burbank. They were, because Lockheed was right there. So the Lockheed had the best tank. It was the P-38 aircraft. So I wanted to build one. I wanted to build one to kind of recreate or honor my heroes, that I was looking at in old books and old black and white photos and whatnot. So I'm building this car, and I'm thinking, every good car back then had a name. People don't really name their cars so much anymore, but it was a tradition for a long time. So I wanted to name the car. As you know, I'm in the bar business.
Right.
So I'm looking at this tank and I'm thinking, what can I name this car? What has some meaning, Now, there was a famous aircraft in World War II flown by Bud Anderson called the Old Crow. It was a P-51 Mustang.
Same squadron as Chuck Yeager.
Yes, exactly. I think he was the most decorated fighter pilot of World War II. He's still alive. He lives up in Auburn, California. He's in his 90s. So the Old Crow was named by him after whiskey.
Right.
The Old Crow whiskey, right? So, and of course, I sell Old Crow whiskey in the bar.
Naturally.
So, what a perfect combination, right? A car built from a World War II plane, paid for by the sale of whiskey. Right. So that's what it meant to me. Like, I'm going to name this car the Old Crow. And it also tells stories. Like, whenever you do something like that, you're passing on a legacy, you're passing on a story about Bud, about his plane, about World War II, about whiskey. And we're sitting here talking about it today.
Right.
20 years later.
And it's Americana.
It's Americana. Exactly. And Americana, we have so many good stories.
Yeah, we don't want those to disappear.
Exactly. So the Old Crow, and I built this in a tiny garage in my house, and so we started racing it. Me and friends started racing the car and setting some records, having a lot of fun. We raced vintage 4-cylinders, so Model A engines, basically. And had a blast, been racing for years. So got a chance to get this shop in Burbank, and the price was right. It was a bitchin' old building. I mean, it was like an old Quonset hut kind of, tin roof, wood framed. And it was one of those things like, what do I name the shop? Well, everyone knew the car, so I just named it after the car.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Now, was the shop intended as kind of your storage space and sort of a place to play, or did you go into it with a mind to making it a business?
Well, I didn't necessarily want to make it a full business. I thought maybe me and friends could do little side jobs, but I want it to be more of like an all-purpose place where me and friends could work on cars, but we could also have a lot of parties. We could have a little museum/speed shop where we could sell vintage parts. So
it was your clubhouse.
Yeah, it was a clubhouse. But really just purely selfishly, it was like, I need way more space than I have in my little garage now. I want to build some more cars. I want to do this. I want to do that. So it was just a space to do that. But then it turned into so much more. It turned into kind of a living history shop, a place that people wanted to visit, a place that we could do photo shoots or just anything creative that we could think of. I'd give it to friends for music videos. We would just do all kinds of fun stuff there. And that's what it became. And it grew itself into a brand is really, it was never an intention. Oh, let's create a brand, or that's how it happened.
Well, but you laid the groundwork. That was just a natural progression into a brand.
I suppose, yeah.
If you ask me.
Yeah, I suppose, maybe in hindsight. I never thought of it that way, though.
Yeah. You've lived in Southern California most of your life, but you actually originally were from Oklahoma, right?
Mm-hmm. Born there. Moved here when I was 10. We had a farm, but then my dad was an artist. Mm-hmm. So he started a stained glass company and did a lot of churches in the Midwest, stained glass. So I grew up, I realized later in life, I grew up learning from my parents and my peers that you just work for yourself. That's just what you do. Like, no one in my family had a job, ever. They all worked for themselves, whether they were farmers or stained glass business or whatever. So I just grew up thinking that was the normal thing to do. Which kind of bit me in the butt when I started trying to get a job, later in life. I think I had a job at like 17 and 18, and I was basically fired from every single job I had. Every job I was fired from. And so that's why I just had to start my own business. Right. And I did in my early 20s.
Now, you were in the coffee business originally, right?
Yeah, opened a coffee house. Okay. Yeah. So I was going to follow kind of my dad. I did a lot of art as a kid. My dad put me in like a drawing class when I was 5 years old. Art was just what I wanted to do. And then I started kind of refining it, like, well, do I want to do architecture? Do I want to do maybe product design or something like that? And so I was taking all kinds of design classes and stuff and doing some interior stuff. Mm-hmm. And then I was going to go to Art Center and do environmental design. Environmental design is really neat because it's kind of like you're designing environments.
Right.
Like Disneyland was done by environmental designers. So it's beyond just designing a thing. But then the opportunity came up to buy this little coffee house from the guy who had fired me several years prior. He called me. So I was working in coffee houses, right? And I was hanging out with artists, we were having art shows and whatnot. And of course I was fired from one, and I would just move to a different coffee house and eventually get fired. And the guy called me one day and he said, hey, you and your friends always said you could do a better job than me. Do you want to buy me out? That's exactly what he said.
Wow.
And I said, let me call you right back. So I called some friends and said, hey, let's try to get some money together and buy this guy out.
Perfect.
So I sold a car.
Okay.
Again, an old car. I had a Nash Metropolitan.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I think I bought it for like $50 because it had no transmission. And then I always go to Bob's Big Boy.
Right.
Hang out. This was not in Burbank. It was the previous location, like Reseda or something. And I was telling somebody, hey, I got a Nash Metropolitan. I need a transmission. And they go, oh, we'll go talk to Metro Bob. He's right over there. I'm like, okay. So I went talk to Metro Bob. He's like, oh, yeah, I got one on the side of the house. $20.
Perfect.
I'm like, okay, I'll come get it. Put it in, Anyway, I sold the thing for like $3,500. And that was the money that me and friends pooled together, and we bought this little coffee house.
Nice. And so how do we get from coffee to whiskey?
Well, it's a weird, it seems odd now, right? But back then, early 90s, this is pre-Starbucks days, right?
Can you even imagine that now?
I know.
I
know, exactly. So coffee houses at that time were more like little bars. Like people would hang out all night long.
Sure.
Play chess, backgammon.
Live music,
have art shows, drink coffee. It was very bohemian.
Mm-hmm.
So it was it was like a bar for the under 21 crowd. I get all the college kids. And so it was a real natural progression at the time. So I was 23 when I opened the coffee house. I'm going to bars. I'm going to Hollywood, hitting all the cool spots and thinking, this is so cool. This is just like what I'm doing, except they actually could make money because we didn't make any money,
right.
But we met a lot of cool people.
You're building a network.
Sure.
You're learning the business. You're learning what to do and what not to do.
It was business college for sure. It was trial by fire. 6 years of just figure it out. Yeah. And so that was my business college. So I spent years wanting to open a bar, running the coffee house, meeting people. I made a little pitch deck book with the concept of this log cabin bar. It's vintage style log cabin bar.
Kind of a Northwoods theme.
Yeah. Which is oddly enough, I didn't even know about Northwoods back then, which is so funny. Other than driving to Disneyland and seeing the snow on the roof. But yeah, it was that vibe. It was like, and I knew all my friends would be into it because I knew everybody in the bar scene as a 20-something-year-old, Yeah. And so it took me several years to find investors because I couldn't do it on my own. And I finally found 2 guys who are still my partners today, believe it or not, 22, 23 years later.
That's rare.
Very rare. Very rare.
Well, you proved yourself early on and you just kind of took one step at a time. And now the 1933 group, which is your company, has 11 different hospitality properties. They all have a distinctive theme. They're all historically significant to Los Angeles. So there's an element, a huge element of preservation, and you're passing along something that would otherwise have been lost.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so fortunate that I could find a way to bring my own personal passions for saving history, even from a completely selfish way, like this place is so cool. I love it so much, and then I get a chance to share it, save it, restore it, share it with the world, and then meet all those like-minded people.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite of all of your bars?
No, I did for years. For years and years, my favorite was always the first one, the Bigfoot Lodge, because that's the one that kind of launched, who we are, what we do, and what we're going to do. But I think that changed by the time the idle hour came around, because prior to the idle hour, we were kind of, I guess, recreating places or creating places that could have been in LA or should have been in LA or something like that. Whereas the idle hour was truly a place to save and restore, a historical place.
Now, the idle hour is a giant beer barrel, right?
Yeah, or whiskey barrel.
Or whiskey barrel.
Yeah, it's a giant wooden barrel, 2 stories tall.
Wow.
Yeah. And at one time, believe it or not, there were as many as 11 or 12 barrels in Los Angeles.
Wow.
Different owners. Just that was a really popular
theme
style to pick as a building. Yeah.
Now, this is called programmatic architecture, right?
Yeah. Programmatic, sometimes mimicry architecture. And it basically was spawned by the automobile, which is the greatest part about it.
Okay, good. So this is interesting history.
It is interesting history, especially if you're a car person.
Right.
So before the Model T was in everybody's garage, you probably had a bicycle or a horse or a buggy, or you walked. And so all these businesses everywhere were just getting people walking by. So all you needed was a little sign that said shoemaker, or tap room.
You'd hang your shingle.
Exactly. But once cars started whizzing by at 25 miles an hour, then business owners were freaking out. And these people who had cars were going much further out of town, further on dirt roads than they ever did before. So there was a new opportunity to create businesses a little further away, and that's what made the city grow. And Los Angeles, a lot of people don't know, is the only city in America designed around the automobile. The automobile completely shaped what we have is this giant grid of a city. Other cities are all European style and weird, but LA is a giant grid. And so that guys were opening businesses, and they wanted the motorists to see their business from a block away. So that was the whole point. And back then you could build anything you want. We had this kind of, as Americans, we had this kind of crazy can-do attitude, anything goes, especially Los Angeles.
Right.
It was the city of anything goes, especially with the movie industry.
Absolutely.
Imagine driving down the street and suddenly you see the Ben-Hur set, or you see, Egypt's pyramids and sphinxes. This started becoming commonplace.
Right.
So why not build your restaurant to look like a giant hat or a giant dog or whatever you liked that would stand out? And that's how it became a trend. And we had hundreds of them around LA. My friend Jim Hyman did an amazing book, California Crazy. And it's a big, heavy book filled with images of these buildings. And you don't realize how many there were until you start looking through this book. There were a lot. But anyway, let's talk about cars.
Yeah. So let me look at my notes. Okay, so over the lifespan of Old Crow, a lot of cars have come in and out. You've done restoration work and preservation work. You've worked on your own stuff, but you've also taken some commissions, right?
A few, or I'll get something that I know we're just going to sell,
right? And so I know that you're really intent on preserving, like period builds and so forth. How do you go about that? Because it's really easy to erase history when you're working on a car that's maybe had a rough life or needs quite a bit of rehabilitation. So.
True. I guess it's the same approach I take with the architecture. And I think that my experience with restoring cars has helped me so much with restoring a building or, say, a historical business. But you have to start with a lot of research, a lot of pictures, a lot of searching for photos and images. Pictures tell 1,000 words, like they say. So I'll do tons and tons of just visual research. And of course, if there's any written research, we'll do a lot of that as well. And then you also have to have a good sense of materials and build quality of the era. That's another thing. And I see people screwing up a lot, not only cars, also with buildings or architecture, because they're using modern materials. So they're using something that stands out as that would never have been done at the time. So I'll ask myself that question a lot. If I want to do something to something, I'd say, would this have been done at that time? And then if you have to answer that question and say, no, it wouldn't, but it would have been done this way. They would have used this material. They would have used that material. And luckily, in the world of hot rodding, there's been a huge group of traditional youngsters have grown out of the hobby, have kind of grown out of the excess of the 80s and swung back into the 90s, where they said, no, let's really look at what these guys were doing and do it exactly the way they were doing it. And I did a lot of that by reaching out to older people, meeting the guys that were in their 80s who had done it in the 40s and spend hours with them. Like, well, what did you do for the steering box? What did you do, for the drag link? And did you run it under this or over that? What about your brakes? How did you make the brakes better? And so all you have to do is just listen and emulate.
I'm glad you mentioned that because, in the 80s and into the 90s, really, the hot rod sort of became the street rod. Mm-hmm. And we had all that neon and those hot colors and modern wheels and tons of chrome. And they became really pretty, but it was not about racing or going fast so much as it was about cruising and looking really good.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. It's funny, hot rodding has just gone through these weird ups and downs. You had the whole 60s Ed Roth show car craze, which I can appreciate. I'm not a huge fan of. I'm not really a huge fan of excess.
Right.
I love and appreciate mid-century modern, but it's just not my thing. I'm not so much of the let's take a rocket to the moon type of guy. I'm more of no, let's just, build something out of nothing in the garage kind of a guy. So, I tend to really appreciate the nuances of pre-war design because it was a bit more function over form, or a lot more function over form.
Sure. Why waste money on candy paint when you can get triple deuces? Right?
Exactly. When you can go faster.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's just make it go fast. Who cares really what it looks like?
Yeah.
So I kind of appreciate that a lot more than the excess of the show car era, especially of the 80s.
Yeah.
But the 80s were excess, not only in the car world. I mean, in clothing and drugs and music and you name it.
Absolutely.
It was the age of excess.
Yeah.
And so was that post-war boom of mid-century into the 60s. And if you look at history a lot, you just see these pendulums. You see the poor working class depression era 30s, and then that slowly swings up to the 50s. TV dinner boom, and then it swings back to hippies living in vans in the 60s, and then it swings back to the 80s and the new wave era.
Right, and those same hippies that were in the vans are now in a corporate setting, and they've got a bad cocaine habit.
Probably, yeah, or they're making Ben & Jerry's ice cream.
Right.
Or they're still following the dead around. But so I kind of just always felt that if your interests just stay classic, just classy and classic.
Test of time.
You never have to go through these phases of having to change your life. I got to get rid of my wardrobe now.
Yeah.
Shoulder pads are out. I need a fatter tie now. Wow. So yeah, I don't have time for trends. I just stick with the tried and true Americana.
Well, now, and the other thing too, Bobby, is that the speed equipment industry was born in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
I mean, Iskandarian, Miller, The list goes on and on. Edelbrock.
Yeah, Edelbrock. I mean, you name it. And what an industry it became. I mean, look at SEMA nowadays. It's a massive, massive industry. Of course, there's good and bad to that because I think the industry kind of ate itself. The Street Rodder, for instance, Street Rodder magazine, it was a vicious cycle. It was like, well, we're going to feature cars that have a lot of our advertisers' parts on them, and vice versa. So it just becomes this circle. And then, of course, then you're influencing, people to build these cars. And then, 10 years later, pull the rug out from under them. Now it's all about traditional rods. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, you told us a little bit about Old Crow, your belly tank racer, but let's talk about racing itself. And mainly we're talking about at El Mirage Dry Lake, right? And at Bonneville.
Bonneville Soft Flats, yeah.
Walk us through that experience.
I think my racing progression, I guess you'd call it, has kind of always been a sense to recreate. Like, man, you look at pictures from the earliest days of drag racing, guys who were out on the aircraft drag strip or something like that. No helmets, no roll cages, none of that stuff. Like, wow, I wonder what that was like, So then I think one of the first things I ever did was go to the Antique Nationals, which was a drag race for guys who just had hot rods or motorcycles. And it was just about like, see what your car will do, and you didn't need much. You just needed a lap belt and a helmet. And so that really was a lot of fun, just doing fun little drag racing. And so like anything, like me, who's kind of like obsessive and a workaholic, and, perfectionist, like I want to just keep pushing whatever it is I do, keep pushing myself to do more and more. And so after drag racing a bunch, it's kind of like, well, what else? What's next? What else did these guys do? And you start, and you meet some of these old guys who are like, well, before drag racing, we'd go out to the desert and we'd drive for a mile as fast as we could go. And you're like, really? And then they say, yeah, these guys are still doing it. Why don't you come with me next Sunday? And so that's kind of how it started.
Gotcha.
A guy named Tom Evans and a guy named Julian Doty were kind of my mentors. And so go out to El Mirage. It was still happening. These guys were still doing it. I think there was Muroc Dry Lake, which is now Edwards Air Force Base. They had a reunion because Muroc had been shut down since like World War II.
Right. But
they had a couple reunions in the 90s. So you went out to that and you see these guys that are still racing. And so that got me really hooked. And but being the traditionalist I am, I saw that most of the cars that were racing, and even the guys that had started in the 40s and were still racing, were racing different cars. They were racing way more modern because to them, and rightly so, their entire life goal was to go faster and faster. So they would stretch their car and shrink their car and make get smaller wheels and tires for their car and all the things it took to make that car faster. But to me, I was a nostalgic lover, and so I'm looking at the old books, the old black and white photos of these same guys when they're like 19 years old, and it's just a bone stock, stripped down, 29 Roadster or a belly tank. A belly tank was kind of like the quintessential land speed car of early post-war era. So I didn't necessarily want to just jump on board with what those older guys were doing because they've been doing it their whole life. I kind of wanted to start back where they started and see what was that like. What was it like to take a car that's primarily stock Ford parts, nothing modern, and make it go as fast as possible. And what's neat about it is there's SCTA books that have the records of what these guys did. So you could look in 1948 and see what a guy running a Model A engine with an overhead valve conversion, with this type of body style, you see what speed he did. And it was only short-lived because then the V8 flathead came out. So everyone jumped over to that to go faster. And then the Chevy came out. Everyone jumped to that to go faster.
331 CAD.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And then
Hemis. Then the Hemis came along. And then they started drag racing on the strip. But so I would look at records from 1948. Say, okay, this belly tank had this motor, this thing. I want to try to beat that. You know what I mean? Like pick up where they left off and try to go faster. And we did. Me and my friends did it. Yeah. So that's the fun part of it.
What's your record speed in the Old Crow?
Old Crow fastest run at Bonneville was 168.
Wow.
Which doesn't sound like a lot because, I could go buy a 350 Chevy and throw it in there and probably do 200 miles an hour right out the gate. But it really wasn't about that. It was about doing as fast as you could go with technology from 1948. That's what it was about. So it was 168 was a hell of a lot of work.
I believe it.
We did a lot to that motor to get it to go there.
Now, you said that's a Model A 4-cylinder.
Yeah, it's a 32 Ford 4-cylinder. Top speed of that car when it was brand new was probably maybe 60 miles an hour. Downhill, maybe 65. So, you have to take that block. You have to put a better crank in it, add some main caps. We put an overhead cam conversion on it, which they were doing. They were doing back in the 30s.
Right.
Supercharge it, put a blower on it.
In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think Louis Chevrolet was building speed equipment for those engines after he left Chevrolet.
Yeah, he was building the Frontenac.
That's right.
That was speed equipment for the Model T blocks. So
okay, Model T.
We're talking, late teens.
Right.
And the Frontenac was quite an engine. Double overhead cam. 8-valve or 16-valve deals. That's the same stuff Miller was messing with. Right. That's like rocket science for the 1920s.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To your average hot rodder, that was some crazy stuff. Because even the hot rodders, even the kids in the 40s, even 50s, they weren't messing around with the kind of technology that the guys in the 20s were doing, like Harry Miller, like the Frontenac brothers. There ain't no slacking when you're frontenacking was the slogan, which is pretty good, right? But we're talking about high dollar stuff. We're talking about the Bugatti of America stuff. So of course your average teenager coming out of World War II didn't have access to that type of thing, even years later. But America was kind of running, alongside, slightly behind Europe in the early days of racing. Europe really ruled racing. And in Europe, racing was a rich guy's hobby. So major advancements were created because they had the money to do it. And it wasn't until a little later in the U.S. that guys started having the money. A lot of guys here in Los Angeles had the money to spend. So there was a guy named Harry Miller, and he started out building carburetors. He had a shop in Los Angeles building carbs. And then he got into repairing race engines and trying to make race engines for guys. And he was making kind of what other guys in the U.S. were making at the time, really large 4-cylinders, maybe 6 cylinders, 8 cylinders, really big, massive things. T-heads, flatheads, that type of deal. And so it just happened that around 1914, 1915, Peugeot from France sent some race cars over to the U.S. They competed in Indy. They competed in some of the tracks, Beverly Hills, Culver City, the board tracks, and they were going real fast. And they had what basically is the same geometry as engines today: double overhead cam, 16-valve, straight 8 engines, and we didn't have those yet. And so one of them happened to break here in LA and got sent to Miller's shop to repair. And so luckily Harry Miller got a hold of it for a year or two to fix it. So he basically just took it apart, saw the technology that was being used, and said, we can do this. And that's what they did. So Harry Miller came out with a 183 cubic inch, double overhead cam, 16 valve, straight 8 race engine. The greatest engine of all time for the era. Talking late teens, early 20s. At that time, Duesenberg was dominating the oval tracks, Indy, and competing with the European guys that were coming over. But once Miller got into the game, and once he perfected his engines, say in the early 20s, he was dominating Indy, and did for decades. He retired and passed the shop on to his foreman, which was Fred Offenhauser. And, later on into the 30s, they came to realize that 4 cylinders worked better than 8. You could get the same horsepower, if not more, out of a more compact, less weight type of deal. More bang for the buck, so to speak. So 4 cylinders became all the rage in the 30s. And then Fred Offenhauser created the Offie motor, which we now know as the Offie, but it was really the Miller or the Peugeot, depending on who you want to give the credit to. And so Offie dominated Indy up until the 80s.
It's incredible.
It's totally nuts. Yeah.
Yeah.
Until the Ford, Cosworth and type motors came out, and that changed the game. But up until then, this aluminum 4-banger dominated American racing, which is pretty neat.
Yeah, it is absolutely astounding. That engine was in nearly every car that ran at Indy.
Yeah, it really was.
With some notable exceptions here and there, but it was that good. The engineering was that sound. It was that, I guess, flexible.
Yeah. It was just finely tuned. They had reached perfection with that engine. And they kept advancing it forward. They turbocharged it later into the 70s and kept going faster and faster. And but that is the the Rolls Royce of American racing. And I got really fascinated by that history because, like I said, progression. If you live a life of progression, which I do, which always trying to achieve the next thing or achieve or learn more or dive deeper into what you want to know about, then eventually, as an automotive connoisseur, you're gonna head back to the early days of American racing.
Well, it's funny that you say that because that's really, we've come so far in 120 years, 125 years. And yet much of the technology that we're talking about was developed in the first 20 years of the 20th century.
Yep. So true. And only thing different is computers.
Yeah.
That's changed, valve timings and carb richness and whatnot. But other than that, you're dealing with the same geometry.
And so I wanted to kind of share those stories with people and capture the history of it. And that was the whole point of starting the podcast and doing these interviews and learning from people like you. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's so many rabbit holes.
Oh,
that's the beauty of it. I mean, there's so many rabbit holes to explore.
Yeah.
And in just American racing, forget about getting into European racing, But even just, lately I've been really getting fascinated by the early 50s road racing of California, because that's a whole nother massive rabbit hole to go down.
Right. And it's not just the Pebble Beach road races.
No, that was just happened to be one of them.
Right.
It was only for a few years.
Right.
But there were road races everywhere around California. It was the big thing to go see. Which brings us to the Spider. I think you wanted to talk about the Porsche Spider that I found in the shipping container.
Yeah.
Right. And how that came about.
Yeah.
that's one of probably the most exciting thing that happened to me last year was finding this Porsche Spider, because this is a multi-million-dollar car. One of the reasons that I found this car is because of my interest in so many different things. Like motorcycles is obviously a big interest of mine. I've had a lot of fun with vintage bikes. So is my buddy Grant. He's a hardcore, a bike guy. He puts on Born Free, that great show. So he heard about some old motorcycles for sale, and he went up to this guy's house and to look at these bikes. And so I got a call from him one day, and he's like, "Hey, do you know anything about Porsches?" And I'm like, "A little. I know a little. I don't know a lot." He's like, "Because there's a bunch of bikes here. I'm going to buy some of these bikes, but the family's got this car, and they want to sell it too." I said, "Well, I'll come up and take a look." And he had said Porsche Spider. And so I just assumed it was one of the fiberglass copies made in the 80s or 90s, right? Because those are really the only ones you really ever stumble on. So I was going up there expecting to find a fiberglass, Spider. And so I get up there and start talking to the family. And the more I started talking to the family, I realized, well, this isn't just a
kid
copy.
car.
No. I mean, he had a photo album, of getting the car in the early 60s.
Oh, boy.
And I'm like, okay, well, let's go look at it. Because I figured, well, maybe it had been hacked up really bad, or, some Corvair engine stuffed in it. Who knows?
Yeah,
right?
because it sounds too good to be true.
Yeah, exactly, right. So we're up on this hill in Orange County that no one in their right mind would drive up to. This crazy steep road. And the only reason you use the road is it's a service road for some radio tower who's at the top of the hill. He just happens to own property next to it. And the family had built this weird, funky little house in the 40s, neat place. And he was a Porsche guy early on. And he had a 904, he had a Speedster. Then after the 80s, he got into motorcycles. And he kind of, put the Porsches aside. And he put this Spider in a shipping container in the back of the house overlooking a cliff. And I think it was for security. Sure. I think it was like, okay, no one's going to steal this thing. And that was it. And then he passed away, and the family goes up, and then they need to sell everything. And so I get up there, and I'm looking at this car, and I'm like, it's aluminum. It's not fiberglass. It's got a 4-cam racing engine in it. I'm like, I think this is the real thing. And we started going through the photo album, and there's like letters from Porsche back in the 60s talking about the car he has, and really fascinating. And so at that point, obviously, the family knew what it was worth. So I had no expectation whatsoever of getting it for myself, which would have been great, but no chance. So I really wanted to be the person to sell it for the family, because the family was like, "Hey, whoever sells this car first person to show up with this much money can take the car." And I'm like, I gotta find a buyer for this, because I'm like one of those orphan leaders. Like I gotta find homes for all these cool things,
right? All
these orphaned antiques. So. I had a friend that I knew a lot about rare Porsches, and I gave him a call. And he happened to be in town because he lives in another state. And we went up there and got together, and we made one phone call and got the car sold.
Oh, I don't doubt it. I mean, that's a holy grail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely a holy grail. So, and for someone like me, as deep into cars as I am, and passionate about cars as I am, those things never go through my hands. Guys like me, they go through Gooding and Bonhams and and Sotheby's, that type of thing. So I felt very accomplished in a weird way to get to sell this car. And I also had I can't call it seller's remorse, because it wasn't my car to sell, but I did feel depressed for a few days because I had spent so much time with the car. Many days going up there, rolling it out, rolling it in, pictures. We took some video, sitting in it, getting to know a car that rare, and then having to see it go away in a trailer. I was actually a little depressed. It was the weirdest thing. I never thought I'd feel that way, but I felt really bummed.
That doesn't surprise me because you were developing an emotional connection to the car.
Yes, inadvertently.
Yeah.
And, things like that have spirits.
Yeah.
Old buildings have spirits. Objects of desire have spirits and ghosts. And I feel like I've always been very sensitive to picking up those things and like maybe in a weird way communicating with them.
Yeah.
Completely. I'm not talking hocus pocus here. I just mean, I feel like these older spirits see me as an old soul and know that I'm going to kind of take care of them, which I try to do.
Yeah, there is something to that sense of channeling the past and the former caretakers, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One good example of that, the bowling alley.
Yeah, let's talk about the bowling alley because it looks amazing.
Thanks. Well, I can't take all the credit because, this place was built in 1927.
Right.
I just took it back to its true nature, really. It had been remodeled over so many years. There were layers and layers. There were 2 layers of drop ceiling. There were walls built. It was completely covered from the original surfaces. Mm-hmm. And so I was just able to strip it all back and kind of restore the parts that needed to be restored. So I just let it shine. And I had a guy working. He was a glass and metal guy. He was working there for like a month or so. And I remember he came up to me one day and he said, there's a lot of ghosts here. And I was like, really? He's like, yes, there's a lot of ghosts here. And he's like, and they're all really happy what you're doing. And I totally got chills, Yeah. And I was like, awesome. That's great. That's like the greatest compliment ever. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I don't care what anyone writes about this place. Having a ghost tell you this is great what you're doing. And it started maybe making me think like, there's definitely places that are like haunted, like bad, not in a good way, But if you think about, let's take the idea of your soul or where you would spend the afterlife, right? Most likely you're going to spend it somewhere you were having a lot of fun. Maybe the bar you hung out at and party or the bowling alley you hung out at. And so I kind of get the sense of when I'm doing a lot of these restoration projects that the spirits that are there are party spirits. You know what I mean? Like they just want to hang out and party and see their friends. And so I'm just helping them do that.
That's interesting. Now, if there was one guy who was building amazing cars and really a trailblazer in the early 20th century, it was Harry Miller. But there was a driver who was the cream of the crop. And that was Barney Oldfield.
Barney Oldfield. So Barney Oldfield started out like many race car drivers racing bicycles. Because that was the hot ticket before car racing really was these velodromes and these bicycle racing. And so he was one of those guys. So Henry Ford creates this big giant car, the 999. Funky looking thing. Nothing like any Ford that ever came after that. Just it wasn't even a steering wheel. It was like this tiller rod thing.
It was like a double tiller.
Yes. Yeah. It was this thing with 2 handles and so he wanted at the time, I think he wanted to beat the Chevrolet brothers because they were making strides. And so he wanted to set up a race. So he needed to find a race car driver. Well, they didn't exist, right, at the time. So where do you look? So they was like, well, this guy's really fast on a bicycle. I bet he is a daredevil and he'll take this thing around. So that's what happened. So he found Barney Oldfield, and he was young at the time. And he said, Barney, do you think you can pilot this thing and beat these guys? And he said, yeah, I think I can do that. And so he did. And so that just launched Barney Oldfield into stardom.
And now we're talking like 1904?
Yeah, or '06 or 8.
Right.
It's real early.
Yeah.
It's real early. And so Barney Oldfield was an overnight sensation, and it goes to his head completely. I mean, the guy becomes a complete ham. He's a complete showman. He's got a cigar. You never see a picture of him without a cigar in his mouth. He's got all these catchphrases, and he's being written up in the papers constantly. He's breaking speed records. He's doing daredevil stunts. He's racing a biplane, or he's having the guy in the biplane come down a ladder and hop in his car. And they're doing, all these funny, he's traveling the country, doing shows. And then he's racing, of course, because he kind of, started racing, and he's racing on dirt tracks and dirt roads and whatnot. So he became probably at the time the most famous race car driver, if not the most famous person in the entire country. I mean, you had Lindbergh, of course, and you had guys like that. And so this is way before television, slightly a little bit of radio. But if you were on the front page of a paper nationwide, you were the famous person of the day that time. Nowadays, you just end up in the trash can. But At the time, you were big. And so Barney Oldfield was big. And so I always liked Barney because he was just a showman. He made a lot of fun out of what he did, but he was also good. He won a lot of races. He was a daredevil. And then later in his career, when he retired, he went into the bar business. So he owned bars around Los Angeles, several bars. So I kind of have this weird, kinship with Barney Oldfield. And so he's buried in this Culver City cemetery. And he raced, obviously, Culver City a lot before the board track was torn down. And so years ago, I ended up getting a little bar in Culver City. And when faced with the task of what to do with it, I immediately thought Barney Oldfield. I want to do a little tribute to Barney Oldfield and tell the story, to tell Barney's story to people who've never heard about Barney Oldfield.
Right.
So that's Oldfield's Liquor Room.
Golden Submarine.
Yes. One of the greatest cars ever built.
Yeah. What do you know about that car? Because I'll confess I don't know really anything about it.
Well, it's a Miller car. Harry Miller built it.
Right.
And Harry Miller built it before he had, this is back when those big giant motors I was talking about, before he had created the double overhead cam engine. So it has a ginormous 4-cylinder in it. It's big hunk of aluminum.
And it was a very early attempt at streamlining.
It was an extremely early attempt at streamlining. It was a dangerous attempt at streamlining. The gas tank of the Golden Sub was a round metal ball, and it just sat behind the driver. And those cars were getting banged around a lot in the teens, on these tracks. They were hitting each other, hitting walls. And so it caught on fire. And Barney Oldfield was able to bail out of it, with just a few burns on him. But it was a death trap. And I think Barney Oldfield even called it a death trap. So it only had a good year's worth of racing in that streamlined, full body incarnation. And then the next year they cut the roof off. So you see, if you follow the photo timeline of it, it's that for the beautiful, year, maybe year and a half, and then the roof's cut off, and then it gets stripped down to basically nothing. And they kept racing it, and it slowly became not as successful because new engines were coming out every year. But that's the Golden Sub, and so there were small little remnants of the Golden Sub left. And a guy named Buck Bodeman back in the 80s had found a few of these remnants, and he built the full car. A guy named Dan O'Davis down in Florida owns it now. A great Miller collector. He's got a really nice collection.
They're amazing cars. Doesn't matter which one. All Millers are just absolute gems.
Well, each one's a work of art, handmade.
Yep.
Yeah. Geez, Bugatti gets so much credit for some reason, and I think just because he made a lot more of them. But that doesn't necessarily mean they were better. Miller only built cars for special clients to go racing. He never built a passenger car to buy on the market.
Well, and he was doing crazy stuff like front wheel drive, and I think inboard brakes.
Yes.
And early hydraulic brakes, if I'm not mistaken. He was tinkering with that earlier than most.
Yeah, he advanced a lot of the technology. And the front wheel drive thing around 1924, 25 was really dominating Indy at the time. It was very proven to work.
Yeah. Fascinating stuff. We should mention another venture that you've kind of started recently, which is kind of a vintage clothing line. Mm-hmm. And I'm really curious about this because, LA is a great place for vintage clothing. Again, we're back to Hollywood with wardrobe departments and period costume. And so it seems like it's only natural, given your other interests, that you decide, I'm going to make some really authentic vintage clothing.
Yeah, well, I think that, like my love of all things vintage, I got into vintage clothing really early.
Sure.
My first car was a 57 Chevy when I was 16. And to me, I kind of felt weird driving the car around without kind of, fitting the look and feel of the car.
Some Levi's and a t-shirt.
Basically, yeah. Leather jacket and,
right.
and kind of just time travel with the car. I love the time travel. Any event I can go to or a moment, even if it's just a fraction of a second where it feels timeless, that's kind of what I strive to do all the time. And so clothing kind of took off. When we finished the Old Crow belly tank, my friend Coop, who was a really great artist, I was a big fan of his work, he wanted to do a logo for the car. So I said, awesome, let's do it. So he created this great crow and smoking a cigarette and a top hat. And we made a t-shirt out of it because when you go racing at Bonneville, you sell t-shirts and it helps pay for the gas money. And they were a huge hit, and we basically sold the exact same t-shirt for 20 years, and it's still relevant today. People still love that design.
Well, it's Coop's original artwork was it hit the spot. It just nailed it.
Yeah. There was a line quality to his work that really nails it. And so, I don't really know anything about the clothing business, or I didn't. So I never really pursued that myself, but then I was approached by some friends. Hey, would you like to design the clothes and we'll make them? And that's something that sounds great. I love designing things. And so that's how it turned out. It turned out I met these guys in Japan, and I was huge fans of their clothing already. They had a store in Harajuku, which is kind of like the Hollywood or Melrose of Tokyo.
Yeah.
And, I went to Japan. I got invited to Japan 2013 with the Old Crow to show at the Moon Eyes show. And so I had been to Japan once 13 years prior and had a really neat experience, but I hadn't been back. So in 13 I go, and I was blown away. I was exposed to this world of Japanese kids who are almost more into American vintage and Americana than I am. Like, they went further down any rabbit hole than I ever went to, with
Isn't
their
that funny?
brand of denim and color of denim. And I mean, they really got into it. And I just thought it was the coolest thing ever, because anytime I meet someone else who is doing something to preserve Americana, like, I'm really fascinated, instantly attracted to them.
Sure.
So I met all these like-minded people in Japan, and I thought, this is just incredible. And they're buying up the motorcycles and the cars, and they're preserving them so well, and they use them there, and they show them off, and they get samples of old clothing, and they just completely make the most perfect replica of that clothing. So, up until that time, if you wanted to dress, like your heroes dressed, or just dress better in general, usually you were buying vintage clothing.
Sure. Because that's all there was.
Because that's all there was. But suddenly, you could buy a brand new piece of clothing that looked like exactly like, a denim shirt made in the 30s or 40s. And a lot of that stuff didn't survive. A lot of that, what they call workwear, didn't really survive that well because it got ripped and torn and burned and tossed away because it was just for working. And they were recreating it, and I just loved it. And so when they got the chance to work with them and give them inspiration, because that the rabbit hole of clothing the Japanese got into started with denim, started with Levi's and jeans, got into more workwear style clothing. But vintage racing wear has its own aesthetic that they never really kind of touched too much base on. So I was kind of excited to get together with them and kind of expose them to that world. One of my favorite things, you look at the guys that were racing these Indy cars in the 1920s, and they were literally wearing Argyle sweaters.
I know.
They're cashmere. Like these, you didn't really have much at the time. And then the mechanics had the jumpsuits, which always looked cool. And you had these little caps. They didn't even have helmets. But yeah, you usually had a tie, a collared shirt, an Argyle sweater, and even the guys, these board track guys racing Indians, 100 plus miles an hour with a striped sweater on.
Yeah, like a football jersey and knee boots.
Exactly. Yeah, jodhpurs and knee boots.
Yeah.
But man, these guys look friggin' cool.
They did.
They look like the pilots. They were kind of emulating the World War I pilots at the time. And
Definitely.
Those guys look way cool.
Well, and for that matter, Eddie Rickenbacker was racing cars on the boards.
Yes, yeah, and created his own car company.
Yep, that's right.
Which is short-lived, but yeah. So I was super excited. So we started Old Crow Clothing, and every season or twice a year, I just get to, design what I think, I usually try to pick a theme for that year. Like we did a nautical theme, we've done a board track theme, we've done a dry lakes theme. So I always try to just do something. It's just a fun extension of everything else that I do to kind of preserve history, tell a story, keep Americana alive.
Right. And obviously this is small production.
Very small. I think there's 10 stores.
Yeah.
And none in the U.S. We just started a website, though, oldcrowclothing.com. So you can buy it. They'll ship it over from Japan.
By the way, anything we mentioned, I'll put links in the show notes so people can just
good.
click right on it.
Yeah, that'd be good. That'd be awesome.
It's easy that way.
Pebble Beach?
Yes. Okay. So, sorry. I bet that was hot.
All right.
I was at Pebble. You and I saw each other at Pebble Beach this year, and you guys were wearing the most amazing vintage, authentic style jumpsuits.
Thanks.
And you were there with a Miller race car.
Yes, that was incredible.
Yeah.
I had never really been exposed to Pebble Beach much. I knew some people who went every year and some people who showed, but I never really got a chance to go to Pebble Beach because it's always the same time as Speed Week. So I'm usually always at Bonneville that year, so I can't do both. And so I've taken a few years off of Bonneville because I've been so busy with some of the bar projects. So I got the chance to go, and they just happened to have a Miller class. It was supposed to be for 2020, which was obviously canceled. So I submitted my application, I think at the end of 19. And luckily the car was accepted. I'm so fortunate to, have gotten in with the Miller crowd, and I joined the Miller Club and started doing vintage racing with the Miller Club. And I was able to actually track down a real Miller race car. And it was Ralph De Palma's last race car of his career. So it's just extremely lucky, extremely rare thing to get. But it's one of my treasures. And so I was so happy to be able to show it off at Pebble Beach with all the other amazing Millers that were there. And I really loved Pebble. And so of course we made these matching jumpsuits to match the car because that's just what you do.
Sure.
At least that's in my mind. That's just what you do. I didn't want to wear a blazer and a yellow tie like everybody else, So me and my crew and my wife, and the guys in Japan made them for us.
And they did a great job. And you also had a vintage car carrier, which what is it? A 40?
It's a 40 Ford.
Okay.
Yeah. It started out as a fire truck, and it became a ramp truck. And I had submitted it to them because I have a lot of photographs of guys in the 20s and 30s taking their Miller race car to go racing, and they're always on a transporter. They didn't just drive those cars.
Right.
And so I submitted pictures to the staff of Pebble Beach, and I said, hey, I'd love to represent this. I'd love to recreate this, and for the tour, and I think it would help tell the story of the Miller race cars, and they thought so too.
Yeah.
So I was really fortunate to be able to take the car on the carrier and do the tour. And we had the Miller sign, and we had some checkered flags, and kind of made a show out of it.
You also, last summer, had the opportunity to run the car in Milwaukee, right? At a Miller meet.
That's right. The Miller meet. The club gets together. Everyone brings Millers. It's the only time of the year you get to see Millers not only just running, but actually driving on a track.
Yeah. And not driven gently, right? I mean, you guys...
Yeah, I mean, we don't... I wouldn't say anyone tries to blow their engine up because these cars are so valuable. But, I try to get out there and do, 75 and 90 miles an hour.
Yeah.
Because you want to feel...
What they felt.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah,
or
really
as close as you can to it.
Fantastic. So now that you're moved in here, things have kind of settled. What's going on next?
I'm currently working on, outside of automotive, I guess I could say, working on saving another famous LA icon. There was a hot dog stand called the Tail of the Pup, which was a giant hot dog. And you would order in the window of the giant hot dog. And that was iconic, not only 40s, 50s, 60s, it was iconic in my generation. I remember in 1980 seeing it. It was right on the sidewalk. It wasn't tucked away anywhere. So if you drove around LA, you saw it. It was right in your face. And you couldn't not see it. It's a giant hot dog.
Wasn't it on Beverly Boulevard?
It was La Cienega Beverly.
Okay.
Yeah. It was there before the Beverly Center. But it was a programmatic architecture building, but it was one of the longest lasting and thriving. The barrel, the Idle Hour barrel, was shuttered for 35 years. But the hot dog was a working hot dog up until 2005. And the owners passed away. But luckily, the kids put it in storage. They knew the building,
was significant.
And they put it in storage. And it finally found its way to us. Now that we are the caretakers of LA history and the restorers of artifacts, people call us now.
Yeah.
So we're in construction now, a great location in Hollywood, close to the original location. So that's in the works now. As far as automotive goes, what's next? We will get back to Bonneville. We will pick up where we left off there. And I have a few more Miller race cars in being built and in the works.
Wow, that's exciting.
Yeah, and we're working on this 27 Stutz boat tail speedster.
Yep.
And I broke my rule. I had my first car was a 57 Chevy, which would break down all the time. And after I got rid of that car and I got into a hot rod, I built a hot rod. I made a rule. I said, I'm not going to own a car again unless I can push it myself. Even if I can only push it 20 feet myself. If I can't, I don't want to own it. But this Stutz, of course, completely broke that rule. It takes like 4 people to push this Stutz. Yeah. It is so heavy.
It's a big car.
It is a behemoth.
It's not that long, but it's just every piece of metal, the gauge on it and
Yeah.
it's a hefty car.
And the scale of it, everything on it is just larger. You know, almost like a truck.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's big and heavy.
It's a cool car. Well, you got your hands full, Bobby.
Yeah, always something to do.
Thanks for having us today.
Hey, thank you so much.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
That's all for this episode of Horsepower Heritage. If you like what you've heard, follow the podcast, leave me 5 stars and a quick review, and you can support my work over at buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage. And you can contribute as little as $2. That's always appreciated. Thank you guys for showing me the love over there. And until next time, I'm Maurice Merrick. Thanks for listening.